Hello! The following video is an excerpt from part 2 of the ongoing Rings of Power critique series on my main channel. Specifically, it's a mini essay found therein on diversity in media, how Rings of Power is shit at it, and on how you could have gone about increasing the show's diversity in a way that would have actually aided the plot, the narrative, and the world building. It is not, I hope, a boilerplate anti-woke, anti-diversity screed, geared as it is toward reconciling two things, story and representation, that have needlessly been set against each other in recent times. A few people suggested that I upload it as its own video, and since this second channel is basically a repository for whatever the hell I want to dump on it, well, it seemed like the best place to fulfill that wish. Links to the main channel and to the video from which this has been extracted are in the description. I want to touch on the race question that I teased in the previous video, but that I didn't have time to go into then, because the existence of Numenor and the Númenóreans invites you to look through a window into a world where people could handle these things sensibly. I said, in that previous video, that Meghan Markle, Disa, the dwarven princess played by Sophia Nomvetsy, one of those, actually proved to be one of the better, more personable, and more characterful of the show's creations. I know a few others who were at least pleasantly surprised by her as well. But the show has a problem with race, and it has a problem with place, and the interrelationship between the two. I apologize for breaking so quickly from the plot of the show, but I do think this bit is important to address given so much has been said about it. The plot, after all, has to take place somewhere, and in creating believable worlds, it's important to understand what somewhere actually is. Because the vast majority of modern scriptwriters and showrunners come from an incredibly small clique of people, and they all live in big cities, they don't really have a conception of what differentiates places and their peoples. Their idea of diversity is what they see all around them, a vast multicultural sea of humanity, everyone from anywhere mixing everywhere they look. To the extent they travel abroad, they will usually travel to tourist hotspots in other big cities, rather than to anywhere truly representative of that host nation. So-called citizens of the world actually know very little about the world, because everywhere they go resembles the international city, and the international city has throughout history been defined against the character of the rest of the country in which it's placed. This is one of the many reasons revolting English peasants frequently took their pitchforks to London, and rightly so. This kind of hyperdiversity is what these writers know, but it is not, to reclaim one of the words they've stolen, representative. Even in their own Western countries, and certainly elsewhere in less developed parts of the world, what marks a place out is, amongst other things, its relative homogeneity. I have a houseboat in London, but I spend rather more time these days back in the village I grew up in. Amongst its handful of defining features is the fact that the population is, almost without exception, white and aging, but that's another matter. It's one of the things that separates this village from London, that separates it in unstated and unremarkable but quite definite ways that you would notice were it not so. It's what gives these places discrete characters. This isn't to say that one is better or worse than the other, but it is to say that they are profoundly different, and the makeup of their peoples, and so the makeup of their cultures, marks them as such. My village is not an isolated case. Or rather, its isolation is general. This is what defines rural areas in large part, and rural areas make up the bulk of the country. The kind of racial and colour mixing you see in London and other big cities in the UK and the US is simply not operative on the same scale in the majority of either nation. Even within big cities, ethnic groups tend to cluster together. Immigrants from one country move in clusters and immigrate largely to the same regions of their new homes. This has always and everywhere been the case. Cities are seldom representative of national patterns. They are always outliers in terms of their population mix. But even within cities, you see ethnic groups clustering. Golders Green in London, for example, is disproportionately Jewish. Tower Hamlets is disproportionately Bangladeshi. In the US, Minneapolis has an outsized Sudanese population, which is largely responsible for the continued and regretful existence of Ilhan Omar. And so it goes. I mention all this because villages, towns, and city districts all have distinctive character that tells you where you are and that marks those places out from their neighbors. Racial or ethnic conglomeration is one significant part of that. Game of Thrones, which was an incredibly diverse show, understood this point. To a lesser extent, because it was restricted by its narrative, Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films did as well. Part of the reason these worlds felt so well realized on screen is that you had immediate visual clues provided by the population separating Dorne from Winterfell in the first instance and the Shire from Bree in the second, for example. But this is now a rare approach. Rings of Power, like Wheel of Time before it, has taken another and less effective one. This is partly because the writers have no real experience of those places in the real world that should serve as inspiration for their creations in the fictional world. But it's also because the point of diversity and representation, as we've come to understand it today, is not to reflect the real diversity of the real world, as they claim it is, but rather a select group of people's ideals of what diversity should be. The irony of those saying that fantasy should resemble the real world is that their fantasy depictions much less resemble the real world than the older iterations they criticize for their perceived whiteness, amongst other reasons. The Jackson film's clear delineation of a homogeneous and isolated Shire and a swarthy, definitely foreign band of Easterlings is a much closer approximation of the real world's divides than Rings of Power's attempts to claim the most isolated group of not hobbits should have a racial mix akin to Chicago. Again, the difference is between true diversity, which must include accurate group formation, and a small group of people's idealized and politicized idea of the point and desirability of a different type of diversity. These two facts combine to explain why people have become so pissed off with the peddlers of this latter approach, and wary whenever they see minority actors cast in certain roles. It is not, as Amazon would like you to believe, that there is a toxic group of fans that just hates diversity wherever they see it. No, it fucking isn't. A useful counterexample here would be Corlys Velaryon in House of the Dragon. His casting did raise some eyebrows. It wasn't helped when he gave, to my knowledge, the only interview of the white people can't stand to see black people in fantasy type. People looked at that casting, remembered what has been pushed on them by activists for far too long, and how they've been slandered by those same activists and the studios they back, weighed the casting decision against what they knew of the world the show was set in, and concluded preemptively that this was likely to be another example of pushing diversity at the expense of realism and adherence to the law. But House of the Dragon has gone on to become very popular, and those complaints have all but disappeared. There isn't much of an argument anymore about the pushing of race and diversity in House of the Dragon, because the show was written well enough to make that casting fit its world. It's explicable in-universe, and it's not being used as propaganda out-universe. Corlys Velaryon has come to seem a natural enough part of a well-written story. And, as ever and always, Arcane's deserved success is proof that the audience would adore an incredibly diverse cast if that cast fits the world it's set in, if it's well realized, and if it's not used to push political points. I've not seen it yet, but I gather Cyberpunk Edgerunners is seeing a similar effect. I raise the issue now because Rings of Power had an opportunity to do exactly the same thing. It's a vast world of many regions populated by many peoples, bigger even than that of Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon. By virtue of the type of story the show is trying to tell, we have, or we should have, ample opportunity to explore these different regions and peoples. There's a way to achieve realistic representation that accords with the known laws of both universes, ours and the show's. And the arrival of the Númenóreans is an example of how the show almost took this simple and popular approach, but then ditched it in favor of the other, less believable and less popular one. The Númenóreans are an island people. In the lore at any rate, they are drawn from those men who stood against Morgoth, given the island by the Valar as reward for their struggles. You would expect to see a degree of diversity at its inception, but that also happened a very long time ago indeed. The men who stood against Morgoth were not all the men of Middle-earth from all places in Middle-earth where men might be found. They were drawn from specific regions. The men of the Southlands, for example, largely sided with Morgoth. The show had an opportunity to represent the kind of group-denominated diversity you would expect to see given that history. For example, you could have cast a whole host of Hispanic actors by geography rather than specific nation and ethnicity to populate Númenor. You would then have represented, if you insist on doing that, a whole swathe of the real world in your fictional one, clearly delineating the men of Númenor from the men of the Southlands, like Halbrand, which after all will go on to become Mordor. Mordor is bordered by places like Khand and Harad, described in the lore as being swarthy with dark hair and eyes, dark skin generally, darker still in Far Harad. Given how much of Rings of Power is focused in this region, and how many of its key characters on screen hail from there, including several main characters, you could have cast Black and North African actors to play them. The Harfoots, by contrast, and especially the elves and dwarves, have closer analogues in the peoples of northern and northwestern Europe. Taking this approach, you'd have accomplished everything you could possibly want to achieve if you were minded toward believable and story-relevant diversity. Large numbers of the principal cast portrayed by actors of different backgrounds, including underrepresented groups like North Africans and Hispanics. A true range of diverse peoples given prominent roles, and a world that is automatically more genuinely and naturally varied in its diversity than the pick-and-mix approach much modern media takes, which seems to think there's really no genuine demographic difference between an isolated tribe of not hobbits, the Númenóreans, the elves, the dwarves, and the men of the Southlands. Instead, in the ship's crew of Númenor, which is our first introduction to them, what we get is pretty much the typical city-minded smorgasbord of backgrounds. And though not fatally, it nonetheless makes Númenor itself much less contained, much less clearly delineated from any other group of peoples, and much more loosely defined conceptually. This problem much more significantly undermines the depiction of the not hobbits, of course, and then to a lesser extent the dwarves and the elves as well. Bear in mind what we know of the not hobbits and later the actual hobbits in The Lord of the Rings. They are a small, highly insular population that deliberately shirks contact with the wider world. They fear, distrust, and are overwhelmed by the wider world. What they absolutely do not do, as a matter of habit and culture, is mix with the wider world. This is what gives the Shire its definition. This is what makes it an entity in its own right, and also one that's familiar to the great proportion of the audience that has visited or that lives in similarly isolated and homogeneous places given character and colour by an autochthonous population. If you decide, by contrast, to give the Shire the demography of Islington, that effect is entirely lost, and the world becomes that much less believable as a result. We can make similar points in similar ways with the elves, and actually create opportunities for even more diversity, not less. The elves are, after all, not one people. They begin as such in the Silmarillion at the point of their creation, when they are one people, the Quendi. But as time goes on, they split apart, culturally and geographically, and so it's not too much of a stretch of the imagination to say ethnically as well. Early in the Silmarillion, the elves are summoned to Valinor, but not all of them go. This is what's known as the Sundering of the elves, when you get the emergence of distinct groups, the Noldor, the Teleri, the Vanyar, and then those that remain behind in Middle-earth further split, some of the Teleri becoming the Nandor, for example, and some the Sindar, as they spread out over Middle-earth and form their own kingdoms and cultures. At the point Rings of Power is seemingly set, centuries if not millennia have passed since all of this happened. This then gives the show the opportunity to do natural diversity, even more of it, more diversity, which I wouldn't be opposed to, and I don't think many fans would be either. You'd still find some people complaining that the elves were described as being fair universally, but you'd greatly diminish the force and validity of that criticism if you made the rest of the diversity part of the world building. Have black elves if you really think you need to, but then all elves of their region and faction should be black. Because, like but to a lesser extent than the not hobbits, the elves are not big mixers. They don't breed rapidly, they don't cross communities all that readily. Yep, the existence of black elves might still have irked purists, but again, Cordis Valerian's reception and the quick dying of opposition to him proves that even law-minded fans are prepared to forgive and forget this kind of thing if the world building is honest, apolitical, non-allegorical, sensible, consistent, and faithful to the fundamentals of its source material. That said, if you were to take the approach I've just set out, you wouldn't need to have black elves because you could have cast a number of your main characters from the Southlands as black or dark-skinned anyway. That too would get around the very thorny question of cultural appropriation that arises when you see traditionally white characters from traditionally white cultures recast as other races in ways that would not be accepted today were it to happen, as it once did, the other way around. It's simply a myth to say, as some on both sides of the argument have attempted to say, that Tolkien's world was always and uniformly white. It wasn't. The existence of the Easterlings refutes that notion. It was vast and embracing in its scope, but it was also written with a mind to realism. Its peoples were naturally formed and naturally placed, and not blended to the point where there is no difference between them. Anyway, I think the approach I've just set out would be called a compromise. This is, I would argue, a principled objection not to diversity per se, but to the manner and purpose of diversity as we are seeing it in Rings of Power. The question isn't, can black people exist in Middle-earth? Of course they can. The question is, accepting that they can, in what manner do you include them? And where? In what manner do you include any race? And where? How do you blend diversity and realism? Should representation be realistic, or defined by the idealism of activist writers against that realism? I've just given you my answer. I think it's fairly well supported, but the overarching point to bear in mind is that it should be possible to ask these questions and make these arguments, and look at least for compromise solutions without branding half your audience, or the other half of the fandom, bigots and racists because they don't conform to your political and ideological idea of capital D diversity. You're welcome to refute my suggestion if you want to. Argue with me in the comments if you like. I welcome it. But otherwise, I don't see the problem with having these conversations. These conversations are good and proper. They are integral to world building. And all these best conversations are integral to story. These are not simply political matters, they are artistic matters as well. Questions of artistic integrity are indeed at stake. But nah, instead, and coming back to the show as it's presented to us, in our first glimpse of the seamen on the Numenorian ship, we get the full smorgasbord of modern metropolitan life, and so, well, there goes part of your world building, there goes your natural diversity. We've got to tick those boxes. And if you don't like these boxes being ticked, you are probably a racist. Ain't modern fandom wonderful?